So let's go ahead and move to the next slide and talk about introductions here. So again, my name is Scott Williamson. I'm CEO of Leasecake. I feel super lucky to have an opportunity to work with really smart and experienced people like Tara, Heather, and Jenny. I've got about 35 years, maybe 37 now. They're creeping up on me in the technology industry, primarily around either technical services or software. Most recently came from JLL, where I led their go-to-market team globally within the technology division. And prior to that, about a dozen years in the real estate and property technology space, working with anywhere from small to really, really big customers, ranging from, the Starbucks and Gaps and Walmarts of the world to Chipotle's and so on. So I will do my best to keep us moving. Heather, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Thomas. I have over 2 decades of experience in real estate. I'm aging myself, but yes, I have worked with firms like the Irvine Company and Kramer Land Company, where I focused on leasing and property management on the landlord side. So I'm hoping to bring some of that perspective to you today. I've been with Leasecake since 2021, where I've helped lots of customers implement their management system. So I'm helping to bring some guidance on that today and help you deal with something you may have been putting off or been a little bit intimidated or overwhelmed by. Thanks.
Excellent. Tara?
Hi, everyone. I am excited to be here too, like Jenny. I'm going to try and be anyway. I'm Tara Hudson, and like Heather, I've been with Leasecake since 2021. I help our customers abstract their leases, navigate their responsibilities, and understand all their obligations like CAM, real estate taxes, maintenance obligations, making sure you have everything you need to get the most out of their portfolio. I also work with our product team to ensure we're always evolving to meet our customers' needs and delivering the best lease management software possible. Before Leasecake, I spent about a decade working at Tolson Enterprises in lease admin as a real estate paralegal. I've always had a passion for the details of acquisitions and leases, and I really enjoy helping our customers here manage their risks within their portfolios.
Excellent. So I can definitely vouch for Heather's and Tara's experience and attention to detail. It annoys me sometimes, but in a good way. So I thank God you're focused on the details. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about why do you want to implement a lease management system? There's a lot going on in the world today, and so why would this be important to you? So if we think about the next slide, the key thing here that we're seeing is that, primarily, let's see, about 2/3 to almost 4/5 of our customers are focused on either restaurant type business or service-based retail or hard goods retail. And in those markets, we're seeing tremendous competition, just hyper competition almost. If you're, regardless of which one of those slices that I just talked about that you're focused on, it seems like there's always a new product or a new service out there, or a new food that's competing with you. Locations are incredibly important for all of those different types of industries. Right now, there's still a shortage of good locations out there from a real estate perspective. And so not only do we see people fighting over the same consumers, they're fighting over the same locations. We do analysis of each of our industries at a pretty detailed level, and all of those industries I talked about are being impacted from population dynamics. So United States and Canada in particular, but also other parts of the world, we're seeing the population curves are kind of slowing down. And so, not only are you just trying to get a brand off the ground or, get your 5, 10, 15, 20 stores or 10,000 stores, whatever it might be, to be profitable, but it's a zero-sum game. You're trying to do that with, a common set of consumers who are either going to buy your burger or somebody else's sandwich. They're going to, go to your massage parlor or spend their money on bowling. They're going to buy shoes here, or they're not going to spend shoes and spend it on something else. So with all of this hyper competition, we're seeing that technology can be used somewhere across each and every one of the different business processes. real estate is one of those areas where, depending on the company, it probably hasn't been used effectively to help you, really get to where you're saving the pennies and the dollars that allow you to grow your business. So if we go to the next slide, when I use the term lease management, we have to think in terms of what does this really mean to you? Because it is a very common term, lease management, but it could mean something very different. So if we go to the next slide, Jenny, what you realize is that a lot of times lease management people um, they equate those words rather to lease administration. I'm going to get all my leases in one place. I'm going to make sure I have all my key dates and dollars and clauses so that I can take some sort of action with that. Maybe not miss a renewal. Maybe on the CAM and tax side. But with all of this hyper competition, we're seeing our customers and the people who are coming to us thinking in terms of, well, it's more than that, right? Because private equity is flooding the market. Public markets are operating very differently in terms of funding. And making sure that you have your books in order from a lease accounting point of view is also very important. So when you go to a financial institution to get a loan, maybe you want to do an expansion of your existing base of stores, you're going to have to show your lease accounting. You're going to have to show your profit and loss, your cash flow statements, your balance sheet. All of that's going to have to tick and tie just the right way. The other thing is that, a lease is really just a contract. Now, we all know it is a very, very specific contract. It is pretty complicated. But the lease management systems that we've had the opportunity to work with, they should be able to handle any contract. They should also be able to handle what we call deals or transactions. So whether you're expanding or contracting your portfolio, whether you are looking to renew or renew plus have new stores, that's a real estate transaction. Lease management system should be able to do that. And then finally, there should be sort of a workflow engine around all of that so that you can manage your work without having to maintain a bunch of different spreadsheets to organize your efforts and the efforts of others. So as we think about that, there are some inherent benefits that you should be able to realize if you implement one of these solutions. We're going to touch on just a couple of those or a few of those and then we're going to get into the pitfalls that you would potentially walk into as you implement one of these solutions. And we'll tell you, our recommendations on how you can get through that. So if we go to the next slide, Heather, why don't you take us through kind of the risk side of a lease management system?
Sure. So I'm going to explain a few of these things also, not just from my experience with working in the leases here at Leasecake, but also from working on the landlord side as a property manager, working closely with the tenants. And along the way, as you're a tenant, you figure out what's important to you and what you might consider a risk for yourself. And I'll get into that as well at the end. But the key risks that we're going to talk about right now are going to be like limitations on expansion, financial risks, and then, of course, like legal and compliance risks. So, as Scott said, we know that you can get notifications and things like that when your rent's going to go up from a lease management software. But what you can really utilize this for is to identify some risks that maybe you haven't really looked at that are in your lease. And having a lease management system is going to allow you to run some reports, look at what are currently in your leases that you're going to identify as a risk, and how you might want to negotiate differently in the future based on that. So limitations such as expansion, so radius restrictions, where you're limited on how far you can expand in a certain radius within the lease. Exclusive use rights. Maybe your exclusive use is very specific. It's not going to allow you to expand your menu or into other areas. Financial risks, of course, that can be CPI escalations, percentage rent increases, unfavorable CAMs. As far as your CAMs go, identifying some things in your operating costs that you're responsible for. And then legal compliance, or such as something like a guarantee. If you're a guarantor on your lease, you may not have the right once you assign the lease, if you want to assign the lease and sell your business, you may still be on the hook because of the guarantee language. So having a system in place is going to help you identify some of those risks. And then my little story for you is I had a tenant once that was kind of in a lull with their business. They needed to get drive business. So I came to the property one day and those huge banners that say, you know, um, you know, bagels or something like that was just like there was like six of them on the property line, completely, against the rules and regulations. I don't know how much the tenant spent on that signage, but I had to pull all of it down. It was a waste. So it turns out that signage was a really important part. It became an important part of that tenant's lease when they renewed. So they wanted to have the ability to have more signage rights upon renewal and negotiated that into their next lease with us. So those are the type of risks that you'll be able to identify with a lease management system.
Excellent.
So we're going to get into growth as well. So still touching on being able to grow your business, utilizing your lease and negotiated points. So co-tenancy clauses, identifying if you have those in your leases, meaning that there's an anchor tenant there, and if that anchor tenant goes dark, which I've seen a huge grocery store go dark and be developed into a call center in a property, and that hurt as a retail center business. So being able to have some leverage there with the co-tenancy clause and negotiate something where, if that anchor goes dark, you're paying half rent, and identifying if you don't have that and you feel that you need it in your area for foot traffic, that's something that you're going to want to have a growth opportunity and renegotiate into your lease. Cost savings and negotiations there. Just opportunities with consolidating and renegotiating multiple locations with a favorable lease structure. Those are all things, running reports on your clauses and seeing where you have growth opportunities, expansion rights, first right of first refusal or first offer. Things like that will help identify some growth opportunities for you. And then just any expansions with your franchisees, in just identifying some of those growth opportunities there, especially with assignments and subleasing as well.
I'm I've had lots of experience in my past life doing due diligence for acquisitions, and at Leasecake, I've had a ton of opportunity to see many of our customers go through the same process, whether acquiring or selling off businesses. If your business is growing or you want to grow it, at some point you too will face due diligence, whether it's for financing purposes, an audit, selling locations, or acquiring new ones. And when the time comes, having complete and accurate lease documentation is critical. Missing documents don't just cause delays, they can completely jeopardize a deal. During acquisitions, buyers don't always receive all the key lease data and documents they need. In some cases, the deal is finalized before you realize what's missing, at which point the leverage is gone to easily obtain those documents. Lenders, auditors, and buyers want more than just your lease agreements. They need the full picture, financial statements, every amendment, guarantees that have been signed, compliance records, especially for things like ASC 842. If you wait until due diligence is underway to gather everything you need, you may end up scrambling. You don't have the time to reach out to all the landlords. That's why having a lease management system is so critical. It keeps everything centralized, organized when you need it. So to stay ahead of these requests, first start with a checklist. Make sure you have every lease related document and accounted for. Next step, create a lease abstract. This will give you a quick summary of the key financials, critical dates, obligations. So even if an original document is misplaced, you may end up having the information you need captured. Next up, verify your rent and expenses. Your rent ledger should match what's in the lease, and CAM reconciliation should be reviewed annually to catch discrepancies. I've come across many times here at Leasecake where what the landlord is saying does not match what the lease is, and it's usually in the favor of the tenant. It's important to be proactive about these potential issues, missing renewal notices, outdated landlord contacts, unexecuted amendments that you're just operating on. These can all create problems down the line. And don't wait to the last minute to work with your landlords. They're not always in the rush you are. If you have everything you need documented and ready to go, negotiations go much smoother for you. Finally, take advantage of a lease management system. Like Heather said, you can run reports, you can get a portfolio wide view for your audits, financing, and transactions without having to dig through your files and emails and spreadsheets that may not be properly maintained or may have a typo here and there. Somebody popped a wrong information in a box and overrode all your data. At the end of the day, being prepared isn't just about compliance. It's about protecting your business and making sure all your transactions, whether it's acquiring or selling, they go smoothly. And Scott can tell you about the pitfalls that not everyone will tell you about and how to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, so let's go to the pitfall. So I tell you, I've been on the buying side and the selling side of software. And I've been on the side where, companies came in to implement the software for me, and then side where I had to implement it. It's always painted as a day at the beach. So hey, get the kids, get the cooler and the floaty toys, and let's go into the beach. And what we've just painted with what Heather and Tara and I talked about is that, a lease management system really can do some substantially meaningful things for your business. But just like a day at the beach, you got to be careful. Sometimes there's glass on the beach. Sometimes there's jelly beans in the water. God forbid that there's sharks in the water. You have to be careful about how you're going to spend your time on the beach, wear the right sunblock protection, etc. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about data, and Tara and Heather are going to take us through that primarily, because that's really the biggest problem that we see with companies that are trying to use a lease management system. As we've already talked about, and as we'll go into in more depth, people may not have all their data ready, not all their documents, their leases, et cetera, and they're not sure what to do with that. There's some very basic but important other pitfalls out there. Everything from not having the clear goals that you need across the common stakeholders. It could also be people taking sort of a phased approach versus a big bang approach, not having enough resources on hand to make this work, and then sort of ongoing training. So, again, we can definitely have a lot of fun at the beach with this, but we've got to be very, very careful. So, Tara, why don't you take us into the first set of issues and how we can deal with it?
Yeah, there is a way through it, even though there are pitfalls. There's processes and things we can talk about. All these challenges are completely manageable with the right approach. And the biggest mistake businesses make is assuming they have to have everything perfect before you can get started. In this lease management system, it can be daunting. But in reality, you don't need all your ducks in a row to get started. You just need a clear plan to tackle the most critical gaps first. And one of the biggest obstacles into getting into a system is messy and incomplete data. That's what we see quite often. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes you can acquire a property and the seller has not given you everything you need. They told you they have given you it all, but it's not there. And how do you know if you have incomplete data? A data gap happens when a critical date or event is unknown, and a missing document obviously means that there's no record confirming what the event was or what happened, or you have an unexecuted copy of the document or it's partially executed. There's no way to know if that document is the final and agreed upon version. So if you have missing key lease dates, like the lease commencement date or the rent commencement date, that's a problem, obviously, because it can trigger future rent increases or the lease expiration most typically. A lot of cases, these dates are not listed in the lease. They are not black and white. They're tied to conditions like 120 days after the landlord delivers the premises or your opening date, whichever occurs first. If you did not open the premises, you don't know. It's something you'll have to track down. There are also scenarios where it's estimated or projected, and it might look like that's the date, but it's contingent on other factors like delivery or permits. So it's just a lot to track down. So what do you do if you don't have that information? You focus on what you can confirm and document it. Rent statements, emails, accounting records that can help you piece together the missing details. And this is why implementing in phases is so important. Instead of delaying until you can find every document, until your data is perfect, you just start with the most critical pieces like renewal dates and financial obligations and refine from there. So you don't miss a renewal while you're waiting to get everything in place. Next is how to bridge these gaps and get your data and organized and going forward. So now that we've talked about data gaps and missing documents, how do you track them down? First step is figuring out where the issues are in your portfolio. Do you have leases missing key dates, like rent commencement or expirations, like I mentioned? Are the amendments or commencement memos missing? These gaps can lead to rent miscalculations, renewal confusion, and even financial reporting errors. So identifying them early is key. To get started, take inventory of what you do have, gather all the documents, and create a checklist of essential records. Oftentimes, the most recent document will list all executed agreements between the landlord and tenant all through the whole process. So if you check the document recital of the Third Amendment, you know there's a First Amendment, a commencement date agreement, all the things that came before are often listed there. That can be the basis of your checklist. Then review your leases for any missing or unclear dates. As stated, the commencement, the rent escalation dates, and renewals. If you're unsure whether something is documented, or flag it for follow-up and just keep moving on in the process. And once you know where the gaps are, the next step is tracking down the missing details. If you don't have all the documents, you can review your internal records, emails, rent statements, lease summaries that have been created maybe by a prior owner, and financial records may give you the information you need. Then check with your team. You might not expect it, but property managers, finance team, legal operations, they may have copies of the missing documents or knowledge about lease terms. And if that doesn't work, landlords and their property managers often have these original documents that you need. And if something is still missing, attorneys and brokers who handled the lease negotiations might also have retained copies of critical documents. Some alternative but less likely sources you may reach out to: utility bills and tax records can confirm occupancy dates, which can sometimes trigger your commencement date. Title reports and insurance certificates may reference lease terms. Accounting records like rent payments and recs can help, find some missing details in there, hidden in there. But the best way to prevent this is to prevent it from happening in the future. Put a process in place for ongoing data collection, assign clear roles with your team to track, verify, and maintain lease records. Most importantly, make sure new leases are fully documented from the start, so you're not scrambling to fill in the blanks later. Having those commencement date certificates executed as soon as your rent or term begins will save you in the long run. Heather's going to talk about what you can do if you can't get the source documents.
Yes, I am again going to go back to how to approach your landlord. So I know landlords can be difficult sometimes to reach or to get in contact with or get a response from. But for the most part, your landlords do want to be on the same page with you. They want you to know your commencement date. They want to know you to know your rent increase dates and your your renewals. They want you to renew your lease most of the time. There has been a market where they did wait for defaults so they could get you out and raise the rent and put it back on the market. But for the most part, retaining your tenancy is in their interest. They don't have to turn the space over, put it on the market, have no rent for a month or two. So for reaching out to your landlord, they're most of the time going to respond, especially if they're little bit larger. The smaller landlords may not be as organized, but if you send an email or a phone, pick up the phone and call them, most of the time they'll be happy to send you a confirmation of your commencement date, your rent commencement date, and your expiration date. And of course, those dates drive your rent increase dates, as well as your renewal. So those are the most important to get confirmed with your landlord. And even when you get that confirmation from your landlord on those dates, double check your lease. I say that because we have had customers reach out to their landlords and come back to us with the dates. And as we go through to enter those dates, we check it against the lease. And the dates may add up to 120 months when the lease language says that the term is 123 months. So we know there's a gap there. And we have actually had the customers go back to their landlord and say that it doesn't quite match up with the lease. And the landlord say, oh, I'm sorry, you're right. This is the correct date. And they had to dig a little bit further. So don't be afraid to approach your landlord. Of course, do it in a non-pushy way if possible. But another way to get that is a lot of times you'll find in the leases at the back, you'll find a sample commencement date certificate or some commencement date memorandum in one of the exhibits, that the intention is that when the lease is signed and rent has commenced, that you will get a commencement date memorandum that memorializes the date that your lease started and the date that you started paying rent and your expiration date. And if it says it in the lease, you have every right to go back and say, hey, this was supposed to be executed and I'd like to get that going and get a copy of it. And because a lot of times those things fall by the wayside with property managers or landlords. They're so busy that they just don't get to those follow-ups. So don't be afraid to ask that. I have seen customers ask for an estoppel. That is a little bit aggressive and it could rub the landlord the wrong way. So I would just recommend really trying to work with them. And as Tara said, if you really don't get a response, you can try leveraging other documents and looking at your utility bills or your rent statements and kind of work backwards to the last time that you had a rent increase and kind of do the math as far as the dates go to figure out when your next one should be coming.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned, Heather, and Tara, very key points. We've worked with customers, like I said, ranging from just a handful of locations to thousands, and you'd think that that these scenarios would show up with the smaller customers with a smaller number of locations. In some respects, the smaller locations, they've got their house in order a little bit more because there's less to manage. And then with the bigger customers, it can be somewhat challenging because you've got so many leases, and some of those leases have been out there for a while. And these tips that you two just discussed, I think, are really key. As we start to move forward, there are some non-lease oriented gotchas out there. One of them is related just to the nature of this type of solution. This type of solution is one that is not just used by lease admin or even real estate. It could be used by legal, in terms of drafting the leases or doing amendments, etc. Could be used by operations in terms of making sure that we understand maybe what our maintenance obligations are within a given location, and should we be paying for it or should the landlord pay for it? Could be finance who's in here looking at it, both in terms of forward-looking lease liability and obligations, could be accounting that's looking at it, or executives, right? It could be all across the board, even down to somebody at the store level who might be in the system pulling it up to pull up, standard operating procedures or a maintenance contract or something like that. When we talk to companies about this, typically one group is driving. It could be the owner, the smaller company, or a C-level executive who's driving at finance, or somebody else. In a bigger company, it could be, somebody in a section, maybe they manage 5,000 leases on renewals, and that's what they're focused on. We very strongly encourage you, whoever is driving the decision to implement one of these software packages, is to, just sit down and do the basics in terms of understanding who are the various stakeholders, what are their goals in terms of timeline, functionality that they're expecting to have delivered for them, reporting that they can do, what access they'll have inside the system, and also what's required for them in terms of how they would help to get the system up and running. So again, depending on the small company all the way to the very biggest of big companies, these are things that must happen in order for there to be, not a bunch of gotchas at the end where you turn the light on with the system and all of a sudden people get to see the room. And if it's not exactly as they expected, then you're going to end up having some challenges. Which leads me to something we've talked about on the next slide. Tara mentioned this a little bit with respect to, I just like seeing this animation, but all silliness aside, we see customers who are trying to do everything all at once. They're trying to do a big bang approach on implementing these software packages. And again, whether you're a 5 location or 5,000 location company, our recommendation is typically to go with a phased approach. And the phased approach takes into account the fact of what Tara and Heather were saying, which is you typically don't have access to all your documents. Even if you're coming off of an existing system, you're going to find that there are a lot of things you're doing in Excel outside of that system, because most systems aren't so easy to use and flex with your business. And so you end up, going into Excel. And so by taking a phased approach, matching that up against what the stakeholder goals and commitments are in terms of what they're willing to fund or do in terms of implementing, will allow you to see benefits sooner rather than later. So from an example point of view, just throw some kind of small, medium, large in terms of how different companies have done it. We had one operator who was running fitness clubs, and I want to say he had about 70. He decided to use, AI technology that was native in our tool to do a very basic abstraction of his documents with a first wave. That way he could get into understanding, in his example, his CAM obligations and were there caps or not. He ended up identifying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of CAM savings just by doing that quick do-it-yourself approach, turn the system on, use the AI technology to implement it. Another customer of ours, very large restaurant group, who's got, 1,000 to 2,000 locations and growing. They did it by brand, right? So they looked at the brand, sort of first come, first serve, who had the ability to get their documents and get that into the system. Heather and her team worked on that to abstract those documents or to pull them from an old system and stick that into the software. And as they did that, not only did they get familiar with the software and have the ability to use the software to tell them where they had gaps in their data, but it also gave them the ability to learn brand by brand by brand, or geo by geo by geo, what were the challenges inside their own organization as it related to getting the software up and running. Plus, because they went with a model where, kind of a first come, first serve, what they were able to do is they were able to get certain users on the system, and those users actually trumpeted inside the organization the benefits of what they were getting out of the software, and it created a bit of a pull where other brands wanted to be on the software to get that same benefit. So now this kind of, as we go to the next slide, goes to one of the next areas, which is resources. So again, whether you've got 5 locations or 5,000, you need to expect and don't fall into the trap of, oh, I just turn the software on and it works. You need to expect that you are going to spend some time on this, right? It doesn't have to be an inordinate amount of time. And we're not trying to say here that, going back to our beach picture, that you can't enjoy your day at the beach. Of course you can do that. But you're going to have to think in terms of who's going to manage this from your side, be the central point of contact for the vendor that you work with. You'll have to think about who's going to be the real estate subject matter expert to answer those questions that Tara and Heather were talking about, right? So if we don't exactly have the ability to get to the landlord's documents or to our own version of the signed executed documents, then we need to make certain assumptions. We've got some companies out there that will use what we call an assumptive approach for how they do this, in how they pick their dates and dollars that they'll go with, rather dates rather, but they may not have the resources to do all this work. So you should think in terms of, how do I allocate the people internally without having to go out and hire a bunch of people, because you don't want to do that. The margins are too thin in your businesses for you to do that. So look to your vendor or third parties to make sure that they either have the staff internally to be able to help you, make sure that they have tools that make the demands on your resources a little bit easier. And using this phased approach, you can use what resources you have, what resources the vendor uses to stair-step your way into a system. Now, the final thing that, and I said this long before coming to Leasecake, having spent a good portion of my life implementing my competitor solutions now, I can tell you that one thing you should be looking for is, can the vendor's solution be implemented by a third party? Can a third party, for instance, abstraction firm, work with this vendor? Can somebody else work on the integrations, et cetera? If that's not something that your vendor is comfortable with, then that's not going to help you with this not enough resources headache that you might have. So just be aware of that and build that into your plan. And then finally, the last thing, the last slide I'd think about on this is related to training. It's very common in the industries that we all work in, where they're, restaurant, service-based, retail. There's a lot of turnover of staff. Okay, and this is, not just related to opening and closing locations, but it's also related to just the nature of the beast in these industries. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have training that is in the application that anybody can access at any given point in time. But you also want to have waves of where, even after you're live with the system, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever the case might be, that you're scheduling training with your vendor or you're doing it internally, so that you can make sure that new staff understand how to use the software, or make sure that you have training set up with the vendors so that you can refresh yourself on what's in the software. It's very, very easy to sort of forget things. In my life prior to coming to Leasecake, I was a Microsoft Office fanatic, right? I could do anything possible in PowerPoint, Excel, you name it. Over here, we use the Google Doc suite, and I had to learn that for the first time. And so I was able to take my knowledge and translate that into Google Docs. The other day, I had to use Excel. And even though I've spent, embarrassed to say, 30 plus years using Excel, going back into Excel after using Google for a year, I'd forgotten how to do a variety of things. It's no different with any software package, right? So make sure that you've got online resources. Make sure you've got access to, call it, open Q&A sessions with your vendor. Make sure you've got, chat bots and various things you can, submit questions and requests to get training. But then also, you have it in your plan. You should have it in your plan where periodically you're going to sit down with your team to make sure that we're getting the most out of the software. Because it's a significant expense, and you want to make sure that you're getting the most you can. All right, so we walked through those areas. I failed to mention up front, but Jenny put it in the chat. If you'd had questions, put it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you guys. Really appreciate it. I think it was really good to hear some of the ways that you can actually get some of the nitty-gritty details out into the open. Sometimes lease documents have a lot of unknown mysteries, so I appreciate the tips. We did have a couple questions come through, so I am going to pass this one to Tara. You mentioned just getting started, even if you don't have everything, but what's like really a number? Like how much of your portfolio do you kind of need to have in order to get it into a system? Like is 50% enough? Like how much really?
I don't think there's a number you need. I think you weigh the benefits or the risk rather. If you know that 10 of your 50 locations are up for renewal in the next couple of years, you start there, you do the work to get those in. Alternatively, you could just send in the information or start with the locations that are ready to go. And so that way you can get using the system, it's all accurate, and then you can start compiling from there. But I can't give a percentage. I think it really is you weigh what is most important to you.
Yeah. So what's upcoming, like what's renewing first? That's what you think is most important. You recommend that?
Yeah, I think that they will show you the benefit right away so you don't miss any renewal options. But like I said, the other way you can look at it is if you have full documents for some of your locations, you get it in, and then it's easy to move on from there and add the next most important group. And so I think you can start with one if that's really what's important to you.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay, Heather, I have a question coming your way. So you talked about working with landlords. Do you recommend that we get physical copies or like does digital copies work? And then if so, like what are you supposed to do with that digital copy? Like where should we keep it so it's safe?
Yeah, I think, digital copies are great. Those work fine. Most of the time you'll see digital copies when we're getting documents sent over. And once we get them, keeping them uploaded to whatever system that you're going to use, and constantly making sure that, well, constantly, but when the time comes and you get an amendment or any kind of modification to the lease, that you're adding that document to your file system. So with Leasecake, we have both location and lease files broken out. So if you have a location file such as permits or certificate of insurance, you can have those uploaded separately, but it's kind of a one-stop shop for each location where a file is uploaded and you can just go to all your lease files and there it is. So keeping a system where you can just kind of store them and keep track of them and updating them is probably the best bet.
Okay, that makes sense. I have another hard question for you. People in the chat are bringing it. Okay, so why do you feel like landlords sometimes have wrong information or like try to overcharge us? Like we have this lease that says that this is what CAM was supposed to be, and then we get these reconciliations that are not accurate. What do you feel like we can do as tenants to make sure that we're being charged like the correct amounts, and like how do we hold them to the lease?
Unfortunately, I would have to say you're going to have to read your lease. That's probably the most tedious thing, but I don't think that it's always, I don't want to say that it's intentional by landlords. I think some things that they are, zipping through, or they're getting all of their reconciliations out at once, where you may see an overcharge come through. You just have to make sure you're comparing what the reconciliation states compared to your lease and what's included and excluded from those charges. Do you have a cap? Those types of things, and really reading through your lease document and what your operating expenses are defined as.
Yeah. So I feel like a report could be very handy to do that. So you're not looking through every single lease, like every single year. So Scott, I'd like to get your recommendation. What fields do you think you should be tracking in some sort of either like annual report or, something in your lease management system that can keep an eye on your charges and your portfolio?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing is I will agree with Heather. I don't think landlords are, trying to take advantage of tenants on average, but there are some nefarious ones out there. We're seeing a lot of interest right now with our customers where they're looking at not just their lease liabilities, but they're also looking at their variable and fixed expenses that are outside of the leases. Especially with some of the recent news about, potentially certain charges are going to be applied to things. Everybody's looking to shave every penny they can. So we would, of course, look for all the key dates that Heather and Tara have talked about. We look for your rent payments. We look for your CAM expenses, but we also look for things like what are the maintenance expenses that you're looking for? Are there utility bills that you want to capture in the system? Anything that would give you the ability to look at store by store profitability, or what we call rent to revenue, or cost to revenue, so that you can look at a location. Because when you go to renew, you're not just looking to renew based on, whatever the terms were before, but you're also looking at trending data. So for instance, I live in the South. I live in Houston. It's very, very hot in the summers here. And an HVAC going down in a location is really terrible for sales in that store. So you want to capture things like, how often am I having to take those types of things into account, and that gives the ability, as you look at a portfolio value, where are my locations that seem to be on the decline, not just in store sales, but maybe expenses as well. And maybe that's the telling story as to why store sales are going down.
Okay, I have another question for Tara. And if anyone on the call, if you have any questions, we're going to wrap up in a couple minutes. So if you have anything else to ask, go ahead and put it in the chat now. I see two more that we have to go through. So Tara, what document is the most important to have other than your lease? Like to try and track down, especially if you're acquiring something. Like, what do you think is a good checklist for you to have of like, I need this, this, and this?
Well, you need them all, but to move forward, what you need is the most recent agreement. It will not tell you the whole picture, but most likely it'll tell you the current term. That is not always the case, but I will say that other than the most recent document, an estoppel can be very helpful. However, you really need all your documents. They tell the whole story. The First Amendment might change all the rents from the base lease, and your Third Amendment says I exercised my first option, and you don't know that the rents changed in the first agreement. So you need them all, and that's the ultimate goal, is to track everything down.
All right, one final question, and then we are wrapping up today. So, Scott, I've got a question for you specifically about Leasecake. How can clients make sure that all their documents are in the system? Like, what type of support does Leasecake have? How do people get started if they want to use like our system in specific?
Yeah, I see that question. So, the short answer on Ron's question that just came in is related to, when you go ahead and load your documents in the system, essentially your vendor should provide a series of tests to make sure that all of the documents were loaded into the right locations. So you'll do what I call a control total test. If, excuse me, say you've got 100 leases, across those leases and the supporting documents that say that you got 227. You'll do a control total to make sure all 227 were loaded in the system, that they're set up in the appropriate locations. Within Leasecake, you can do reporting, so you can understand what the obligations were and what the financials were. You can do a control total against those financials, map it to what you're actually paying in terms of rent to make sure that those things match. Yes, we do assign an account manager. We also have an implementation team that consists of, people from our CS and real estate team, like Heather and Tara, and other people on the abstraction side. We also can provide services if you've got an existing system and you're pulling data from an existing system to make that work. So there are plenty of different mechanisms to just make sure that the aggregate numbers match in terms of documents, obligations, et cetera. And that should help you have certainty that you've got all the right documents in there. Now, the thing that no vendor can do is they can't make sure that you go and get all of the appropriate executed documents. So what Heather and Tara were talking about earlier is really key. If you don't have all those documents, we can provide a way to assist you to get those documents from your landlord. But once you've got those documents, absolutely, we or any vendor should be able to do control totals on that. And, I can't speak for other vendors, but we absolutely do provide a team to help you get that information to the system.
Well, I appreciate everyone who was able to join us today. I hope that you found it informational. And if you are interested in learning more about Leasecake in specific, I'm going to send you a follow-up email with how to get in touch with us. And if you want this video recording, that will also be coming out tomorrow. So keep an eye on your email. You will be hearing from us sometime tomorrow morning. And thank you again for joining. Have a great rest of your day.